Church history, Baptist history in particular. We've been studying the cost of liberty. It just didn't fall out of the sky into the world. Liberty is something that is, religious liberty started in America. It had tried to start in Europe. The Baptists in Europe tried to teach religious liberty, but it was not acceptable very much. In Holland, there was the experiment there. In England, John Bunyan suffered, when he was writing Pilgrim Progress, he suffered from religious persecution in England. The state and church marriage has been a horrible disaster for humankind. Church-state heresy, hellish division, devisement, whatever you want to call it, has been horrible on human beings. Roger Williams and Dr. John Clark came to America. Roger Williams was a very outspoken person. He was basically excommunicated from the Puritans, the Church of England, and went to live among the Indians, which he championed, and helped found Rhode Island as the first religious liberty in the United States, or in America, that is. In church history, it is bloodshed. Church history is a history of wars. It's a history of oppression. And all the time in the background there were Baptists trying to mind their own business, separated from the church and state. We have the Church of England, we have the Catholic Church, we have Islam, we have all of these church states. We have Lutheran, we have the Presbyterian. All of these, all Calvin and Luther knew was a church and the change, this marriage of the church and the state. In chapter number 3, in John T. Christian's book on a history of Baptist, this is one of my textbooks when I teach church history. It's one of them. There's about 300 or 400 of them over there that I use. It said the chartered rights of the Massachusetts Bay Colony have been variously interpreted. The position has been taken that it was a commercial transaction, while others have placed more emphasis upon the spiritual bearings of the charter. Some hold that his intention was the foundation of a Christian state. It was. When the Pilgrims came over here, they wanted to escape persecution and from Europe, and they came to America, and they established a more empirical, totalitarian rule than they ever had in Europe, but it was on their favor, not against them. They persecuted anybody of any other faith. A man by the name of Stiles in 1783 said, "It is certain that civil dominion was but the second motive, religion the primary one, with our ancestors in coming hither and settling this land. It was not much their design to establish religion for the benefit of the state, but as a civil government for the benefit of religion." Constantine. The church and state were very practical to Constantine. When Islam stuck its ugly head up, the church and state was it was very advantageous for them. The church and the state. The church and the state are one. as a civil government for the benefit of religion and subservient and even necessary for the peaceable enjoyment and unmolesting exercise of religion, of that religion for which they had fled to these ends of the earth. But they would give no religious liberty to anybody else except for them. By the patent certain, select men as magistrates and freemen have power to make laws, the magistrates to execute judgment, and justice among the people according to such laws. By the patent we have power to erect such a government of the church, a government of the church, by the church and for the church, as is most agreeable to the word, to the estate of a people, to gaining the natives of God's time, first to civility and then to Christianity. To this authority established by this patent, Englishmen do readily submit themselves. Foreign plantations, the French and the Dutch and the Swedish do willingly transact their negotiations with us as with a colony established by the royal authority of the state of England. And that was a quote from Armitage's, Joseph Armitage's The History of the Baptist. Peter Oliver said, I have thus sketched and outlined a glowing picture wherein the whip, the pillory, and the gallows are exhibited as weapons of defense in the hands of the elders of Massachusetts. Did you just hear what I said? And these elders are the church state. Weapons of defense in the hands of the elders of Massachusetts, the gallows, the pillars, and the whip. They would beat you and kill you into submission. If they couldn't beat you into submission, they'd hang you. This is called the Puritan Inquisition, and repeopled its dungeons with the victims of a narrow and austere faith. I have exhibited those great principles of intolerance, not tolerance, which our ancestors recorded in their histories and enrolled among their laws. History will be repeated if you don't know history. America is in the throes of this very situation at this moment. Totalitarian rule, total lack of democracy. And yet, whatever they say is right, and if you disagree with it, you were wrong. And that's exactly what happened right here. This is what we call intolerance, totalitarian rule. And regarded simply as a legal view, it is a startling fact that every execution was a murder. Every time they executed somebody, it was for religious freedom and it was a murder. Every mutilation and maiming, every whipping, every battery, every fine, every extortion, every disfranchisement and outrage, and all the breaches of the charter. There were no laws in England for hanging or mutilation or flogging the king's subjects because they did not profess the Puritan faith. There were no laws in England that did that. While to disenfranchise a member of the corporation for any case unconnected with the objects for which the charter was given was a clear violation of justice and authority of the Crown of England. Unless then we lay aside abstract right and wrong. Abstract right and wrong, isn't that? Right is wrong in America, and wrong is right. They turn the criminals loose. They let illegal aliens vote. When you let an illegal alien vote or somebody that's not a citizen, you have disfranchised the citizen. Because the illegal alien or the non-citizen will agree with you. That's the biggest thing, to get them to agree, get them to sign a paper, get them to do whatever they can do so we can continue to rule and continue to stamp out our laws as we see fit. You don't think that this situation we're living in today is not a religion? Communism is a religion, people. Communism and socialism is a religion. Unless then we lay aside abstract right and wrong to disregard the nature of the charter, the liberty of the subject, and the supremacy of the parliament, the jurisdiction of the royal courts, the authority of the law, the prerogative of the king, we cannot consider the persecutions of the elders of Massachusetts merely as an act of intolerance. They were, in any proper legal sense, violations of and crimes against the laws of England. England didn't do this. There were some bad times when Mary, Queen of Scots, got in there. She started persecuting all of the Protestants, started killing them right and left, imprisoning them. They burned so many Baptists in England that they ran out of firewood. Burning at the stake, and they did that in America, people. Well, the king did not bestow upon the grantors of the charter the power of removing the kingdom of his loving subjects in order that they might deprive them of their ears, their liberties, for refusing to conform to sectarian religion. They cut their ears off, people. They cut their noses off. They pulled their tongues out and with a hot iron run a poker through it. They blinded them. Deprived them of their ears, their liberties, for refusing to conform to sectarian religion. Nor was the familist, or the Quaker, or the Anabaptist so much to blame as those who persecuted a royal and sacred franchise to purpose which were hostile to the best interests of the empire. Religious persecution was contrary, hostile to the best interests of England in America. And above all, it should be remembered that the Puritan Church is chiefly responsible for the guilt of those proceedings. The state was merely a precept criminus. For all the doubts she remained many as her authority to set under the charter, she even applied to the elders for counsel, and the elders uniformly supported her claims and removed her indecision. One of the first acts of the colony was a violation of the rights of conscience. John Endicott, who had previously been in the Bay, was chosen as first governor with a company soon to set out for Salem, where he organized the colony in 1628. 5 counselors were chosen in England, and the remaining 8 were to be subsequently chosen in America. In 1629, several vessels reached Salem bearing a company of immigrants, among whom were the ministers of Higginson and Skelton. 2 ministers, Higginson and Skelton. They were chosen ministers of congregation. On the heads of these ministers, the hands of 3 to 4 grave members were laid with solemn prayers, laying on the hand. On August 6th, the church was formed of 30 persons, and the ministers were again ordained. The church instituted great reforms in ritual and practice of the Church of England. Among 5 counselors chosen in England to associate with Endicott were 2 brothers, John Brown and Samuel Brown. The one a merchant, the other a lawyer. These men were the highest character. At the close of the long and important document sent by Governor Craddock, the president of the company in England, these brothers were particularly commended to the regard of Governor Endicott. The brothers were not impressed with the changes made in the church. And with some others they met and read the Book of Common Prayer. They were immediately summoned by the governor and ministers, and the Browns expressed opinion that the church and ministers were separatists and would become Anabaptists if not watched carefully. They're reading the Bible, people. The Bible makes you a Baptist. The ministers that declared that they had not separated from the church but only left off its corruptions. The governor and the council and generality of the people, says Morton, did not approve of the answers of the ministers. And it was, however, decided that the Browns had done tended mutiny and faction. If you don't agree, you're a bad guy. You get out there on the internet and you tell them that the 2020 election was rigged, and see how long you stay there. You just pay attention to what's going on in the world today. Pay attention to what's going on in the world around us. History repeats itself. If you allow it, it'll repeat itself over and over again. And they were sent home on the returning ship. Such was the early act of oppression. Get them out of here. You're not welcome. The act of the governor and the ministers brought letters of caution from England. England said, be careful what you're doing over there. You're not doing this to the best interest of the empire now. We don't persecute people like that over here. It is possible some of the undigested counsels have too satanary been put in execution, introducing any laws and commands which may render yourself as distasteful to the state here. They also express their fears that the ministers have overshot themselves in power. You put people up there in Washington, D.C., and you got to watch them like a hawk. They'll take more power than you ever gave them. They're supposed to be representing you. They represent their interest. There are lifetime criminals up there. Families of lifetime criminals up there. There ought to be some way to curtail this. There ought to be some prohibition of this. Earlier, as Roger Williams said, we're all on the ship together. The head, the commander of the ship, the captain of the ship ought to go under the same rules of law and order as you do. And his family. And all of the sailors, all the merchants there are all under the same rules. You can go to believe anything you want to believe. You don't have to pay for my minister. I don't have to pay for yours. You don't have to come to my church. You don't have to go to your church or assemblies. We tolerate each other, but we all obey the same rules. We don't steal, we don't lie, we don't cheat, we don't kill, we don't maim. In an early date in the Massachusetts colony, attention began to taking care of the rise of the Baptists, as they were invariably canned by their enemies, Anabaptists. Amongst those who at this time that removed from about Boston, divers inclined to rigid separatism and favored Anabaptism, and they removed to Providence to join Mr. Williams and those of his company. They said that these Baptists were anti-Christian because they didn't allow baby baptism. They didn't believe it. They thought it was a hellish crime against God. It says that this form of belief, based on the Bible, was dangerous to the colonies, dangerous to the support of their churches and to their ministers. They enacted cruel laws. The records of the Suffolk County in 1640 make mention of the prosecutions of the Anabaptists. Frequent references to Baptists and sundry communities would indicate something of their activities. Their views were secretly promulgated. They didn't go out and preach on the corners. They preached it in their little assemblies or little congregation. And there was much danger of infection of many of the persons by these Bible preachers, these Bible pounders. One of these instances was Lady Moody, an eminent woman of the colony, widely known. She was cited to appear before the quarterly court of Salem on December 14, 1642, along with others. The record says that Lady Deborah Moody, Miss King, and the wife of John Tilton were presented for holding that the baptism of infants is no ordinance of God. You'll not find it in scriptures. Now it says here, the mother of David Yale, the father and founder of Yale College, and the wife of Governor Theophilus Eaton, was tried by the New Haven Church for divers scandalous offenses by toying with the doctrines of the Anabaptists. She had come to uncertain stipulations which interfered with the conformity in the church practices. William Witter was arraigned on February the 28th, 1644, before the Salem court. This is the Salem witch trials, people. The record of that case as follows: for entertaining that the baptism of infants was sinful, and now coming to Salem court, answered humbly and confessed his ignorance and his willingness to see the light, and seemed to be staggered. It was said that he called an ordinance of God a badge of the whore. The sentence was that on some lecture day, the next 5th day being a public fast, to acknowledge his fault and to be enjoined to be here next in the court of Salem. William Witter did not change his opinions, so the record of the court reads, at the court of Salem, 18th day of the 12th month, 1645, William Witter of Lynn was presented by the grand jury, saying that he stayed with it, that while a child is baptized, when he does that, he worships the devil. You've gone away from scriptures. West, dealing with him thereabouts, he further said to him, they who stayed at the baptizing are permitted, or this would not permit the baptizing of a child, did take the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost in vain, and broke the Sabbath, and confessed and justified the former speech. He was sent to answer at another session of the court. And he was again before the court for absenting himself from public ordinances. He didn't go to their church. You had to go to church. It was a forced thing. You had to go to church or else be fined or whipped or put in stocks, beaten, drowned, hung, 9 months and more for being a rebaptizer. Thomas Painter had become a Baptist. He would not allow his wife, a member of the church, to have her child baptized. He was presented and required to cease from this opposition. You know, our children are sent to school, public school today, and they're taught woke. They're taught that all white people are bad people, that they have taken advantage of the whole world, and that there needs to be a recompense for all of this, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the one talking to you, I'm only 1/32 white, people. I'm old Indian, besides that. Yes, they did some things. But you are not responsible for what your grandfathers did. In a treaty or something like that, maybe there needs to be reparations. But I'm not responsible for what happened at the Little Bighorn. My relatives were there. And they killed Custer and all of his men. And basically it was Custer's fault. He would have been, if he hadn't become a national hero, he would have been shot before a firing squad for what he did. Horrible what that man did to his men. Mm-hmm. Still refusing the distribution of the church and asserting to the baptism of the colony as anti-Christian and affirming that the same before the court, they sentenced him to be whipped because he cannot able to pay a fine, so they're going to beat him half to death. That this punishment was not for his opinion, but for reproaching the Lord's ordinance, and for his bold and evil behavior both at home and in the court. It may be that some others at the same time came down from Providence, Rhode Island, and entered into the assemblies in the same places in Massachusetts, and would, in time and singing, keep their hats. They wouldn't take their hats off in that church. It's against the law not to take your hat off in church. The Baptists wore their hats in church because of that law. As it were, the brave it out with them, and so occasioned disturbance and the breach of peace. If any such have by that means been brought to suffer corporal punishment, they will certainly, in the amount of all indifference and prudent people, have cause to find no fault with anything but their own obstinance and folly. It's not our fault because we had to beat you and kill you and torture you. It's your fault because you wouldn't conform. Conformity. Does that ring true today in America? Conformity. Conform or be an outlaw. Conform, 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 or you're an enemy of the state. Sound familiar? Yeah. You're an enemy of democracy. And yet the enemies of democracy are the ones saying that. These incidents and other activities of the Baptists stirred up the governor in the province. Mr. Endicott began to be a sovereign against all of these sects, says William Bentley. A magistrate did not bear the sword in vain. Persons addicted to the tenets of the Anabaptists were deprived of personal property. Being confined, being under severe prohibitions, the whole number did not exceed 9. Mr. Norris never appeared inactive in any such proceedings, and comparative tranquility of the town during his ministry. It is evidence of his moderation. The alarm against Anabaptists had been so great that in 1644 a law had been made against them. The law passed against the Baptists in Massachusetts November 13, 1644. Forasmuch as experience hath plentiful and often proved that since the first arising of the Anabaptists about 100 years since, they have been incendiaries of the Commonwealth, the infectors of persons in main matters of religion, the troublers of churches in all places where they have been, and that they have held baptism of infants unlawful, have usually held other errors and heresies together therewith, and they have, as other heretics used do, concealed the same till they spied out a fair advantage and opportunity to vent them, to say, you know, they have to be careful what they say, but then they say it. You got to be quiet. Shut up. By way of question or scruple, whereas many divers of this kind have since our coming into New England appeared amongst ourselves, some whereof have, as others before them, denied the ordinance of the magistracy, the lawfulness of making war, and the other. Now, talking about war is religious war. Others, the lawfulness of the magistrates and their inspections into the breach of the first table, that's talking about church, which opinions, if they should be conceived at by us, are like to be increased among us, and also must necessarily bring guilt upon us, infection and trouble for the churches, and hazard to the whole commonwealth. It is ordered and agreed that if any persons or persons within this jurisdiction shall either openly condemn or oppose the baptizing of infants, or go about secretly to seduce others from their approbation or use thereof, shall purposely depart the congregation at the administration of the ordinance. In other words, they leave. When they get ready to baptize the baby, they walk out, they turn their backs, they leave. What? You're going to pay for this. You're going to pay for that. You will not say, I'm wrong. You will not say, I'm wrong. You will not disagree. shall deny the ordinance, magistracy, or their lawful right or authority to make war or to punish the outward breaches of the first table. The make war is to make war on the Baptists and the Quakers, and shall appear before the court willfully and honestly to continue therein due time, means of conviction. Every such person shall be sentenced to banishment. Death, pretty much. They cut their ears off. If you went around with one ear, you were a Baptist. If you had your lips cut off, if you had your nose partially cut off, if you had a hole in your tongue from a hot poker, you were a Baptist. That if any Christian within his jurisdiction shall go out to subvert and destroy the Christian faith or religion by broaching or maintaining any damnable heresies, and deny the immortality of the soul, and go on down through here, shall deny the morality of the fourth commandment, and shall openly condemn or oppose baptizing of infants, shall purposely depart from the congregation at the administer of those ordinances, or shall deny the ordinances, magistracy, or lawful authority to make war, or to punish the outward breaches of the first commandment, or shall endeavor to seduce others to say these errors or heresies above mentioned, every such person continuing to be obstinate after due means and conviction shall be sentenced to banishment. That's on page 55. There's a lot more to go, people. A lot more to go. The cost of liberty. The cost of religious liberty and the cost of liberty is in your lap today. It's in your lap today. At every election, at every public meeting, when your children go to school, when your children come home from school, when your children are turned against you, when your children are indoctrinated and brainwashed. That's the way. That's the way. They call the Baptist way an evil way, interpreting the Bible by itself, believing what the Bible says, objecting to perversion of the ordinances of God. And now we come to that time again, a time of decision. Time of decision. Our Father, we send this message out for your honor and glory. Please use it throughout the world to wake up people to the world we live in today. Father, please forgive me where I fail you. In Jesus' name I pray.